In the understatement of the year, we have a lot of legal news to cover pertaining to this White House. Nothing new there. Let's start off with the Trump tax returns. Well, we learned today the Supreme Court, they've temporarily halted a lower court order that told the president's accounting firm to hand over 8 years of documents to House Democrats. With the hold in place, the highest court in the land is also considering whether to take up this case. Now, if it does, it could be a seismic ruling because in many ways it will help decide the scope of presidential power and how this president is in fact wielding it. Plus, the president is continuing to go after impeachment witnesses, of course, via Twitter. During Thursday's live hearing, Chairman Adam Schiff, he called out the president in real time.
Mr. Ivanovich, as we sit here testifying, the president is attacking you on Twitter. And I'd like to give you a chance to respond. I'll read part of one of his tweets. Everywhere Marie Yovanovitch went turned bad. She started off in Somalia. How did that go? He goes on to say later in the tweet, is a U.S. president's absolute right to appoint ambassadors.
Now, over the weekend, he did it again, this time going after an aide to Mike Pence, yes, his vice president, Jennifer Williams. Now, she is set to testify tomorrow morning, but she's already said things in a closed hearing that clearly got under the president's skin. Williams, she was on the call between Trump and the president of Ukraine and said it was unusual and, in her words, inappropriate. After her testimony was released, the president posted a tweet calling her a never-Trumper, even though there's no evidence of that whatsoever. He also accused Williams of attacking him. So, a lot to unpack there with my next guest, former federal prosecutor Stanley Tuardi, and I want to get into the back and forth of the president and how what we saw last week and what we expect this week. But were you a little surprised the Supreme Court chose to get involved? Now, they haven't chosen to take the case up yet, but to put a stay even in place because it seemed that it was settled law. It seemed that there was, the issue of stare decisis wasn't there, that they had to get involved in the situation. But yet they've chosen at least to stick their toe in. Whether or not they fully do, I guess we're going to learn sooner than later.
So not at all surprised, because if by the time the Supreme Court could act substantively on it, it would be too late. The documents would have been turned over. So this is not unusual to see in a matter like this, where the turning over the documents really moots the legal issue at the end of the day. I think it's also interesting that...
But just so I'm clear, Stanley, they got to get, as I understand it, by the 21st, in just a few days, this week, the arguments for appeal, the president's attorneys have to turn it over. How would the timeline work if they chose to take the case? I'd assume they'd do it for the January session, right?
I think they would try to. Of course, they would expedite it there. What I was going to say, though, that there might be another case that's coming with it, which could tell you something. As you recall, a couple weeks ago, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, in a similar case, but involving the Attorney General of New York, an investigation, held that the president's accounting firm had to turn over documents to the prosecutors, and that's a second case. So you had to have those two cases consolidated in essence on appeal. Those are two cases that similarly, go after presidential power. One in the criminal context, one in the impeachment context, and would be a perfect vehicles for the Supreme Court to really address stuff which is not entirely clear. The law is not 100% clear on these issues.
But so I'm clear, if they did choose to take it, and whether they put the cases in terms of a bundle and heard them together, would it be fast-tracked? Because potentially there could be some revelatory stuff in those returns here that would be impactful to the investigation, different lines that they could go down, et cetera. If they took it in the beginning of January, when would theoretically the earliest the decision be so that then they can actually go through their returns if, in fact, the court says, yes, it's the role of the legislative branch?
It's hard to tell when it would be. Sometimes they would rule from the bench and then come out with a written decision afterwards. I think probably the best analogy is the Bush versus Gore, back in 2000 with the election.
What you saw was interesting was former Justice O'Connor said, if we had to do it over again, we shouldn't have done it. Because the court was, at least at one point, thought to be the one branch of government that wasn't hyper-politicized. Now it's being looked at through this lens, and just imagine if they get involved in this case and they're seen, for example, as protecting the president here or giving him unchecked power and all the rest. I mean, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't.
Or what if they don't? I mean, you listen, if you look back at the Nixon time period, you had a court that was a Republican court, so-called Republican court under today's terms, and they ruled against Nixon. You know, and I think one of the things about John Roberts is you watch him as he's been a Chief Justice. He is very concerned about the court, the history of the court, and I think he's one that would use a lot of suasion, moral suasion.
And as usual, folks, if it gets through the House, and even on party lines, certainly there's votes to spare right now, you would think, and it goes to the Senate, the presiding judge in that trial, none other than Justice Roberts. Okay, this week, obviously a lot of important testimony, but I gotta think Sondland is going to be the key. Now, people can legitimately say, you know, the credibility of him as a witness, since he's already changed the story at least once. That said, given what we've heard from two eye or ear witnesses to his conversation reportedly with the president and how he described the contents of the conversation and some of the additional information that's been layered onto this, he potentially, if not probably, could be the key person to say, this is what the president told me he wanted, this is what I conveyed to the Ukrainians, and this was the motive and the means in which we did what we did.
He's going to be the first actual witness, the first-hand witness that we're going to hear in the impeachment proceedings. And that's very important, because what we've heard thus far from some very distinguished individuals are what they've heard or what people have been telling them. This is going to be an eyewitness to the event. I think that the other two who I think would be very important witnesses are John Bolton, of course, and you know that we're waiting to see whether or not the courts will say he's allowed to testify. And I think the acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney, I think that, you know, from what his role is in all this is going to be very important. Those are first-hand witnesses who are going to be very important for what goes on here.
And I would assume that if you're the counsel for Mr. Sondland, you're telling your client, you better be truthful and upfront here. I mean, just go look at a few other folks that are wearing orange jumpsuits now. This is not the place under oath to be telling yet another version of the truth, right?
That's exactly right. No. How often, what did we learn from the Nixon event in the first place? The cover-up is worse than the crime.
Yeah.
Yep, and that's what would be the problem here.
Obviously, this is not a criminal trial, but a political one. Yeah. Speaker Pelosi's got to wrestle with an election year coming up, the timeline, how narrowcast to make this, but the idea that it's just going to be about the Ukrainian call or what that conversation was, I think is misplaced, because you don't know what could come out of additional testimony, and we've certainly seen that in other probes. And what if these tax returns, the Supreme Court says, no, you know what, you guys have at it. Who knows what turns out of that? Who knows? For what we know, the SDNY might be coming out with something on some other related things. Now we hear that the Mueller report, maybe the president lied as a part of that. If you were giving counsel from a practical level, let alone handling prosecutions in the past, do you let the facts take it where it may, or do you try and keep this thing focused just to Ukraine?
If you're the president, you want it only on the Ukraine. If I'm advising Congress, I'm going to say let's this play out a little bit. Again, though, you're exactly right. The problem is, how long does this impeachment hearing go, and does it start interfering with the election next year, which is the ultimate game for the Democrats?
What's your sense? Last week, I think people saw some really credible public servants that came out. I didn't hear anyone really attacking their credibility or even the veracity of what they said. The debate was, well, no harm, no foul, or whatever the evolving explanation or rationale was. This week, from the folks we're going to hear, do you think it's just an additional layer, or do you think it becomes, you know, that there's a cumulative effect here and it looks worse and worse for the president? The polling seems to say it's not going in the right direction for him.
I think the key is going to be what they say, what these eyewitnesses have in fact to say that places them there and gives you this story. You know, it's sort of like when John Dean showed up at, you know, is there going to be a John Dean in this?
And do you think you need that here? Do you think you need to have that definable moment where people catch their breath?
I think if you don't have that, you're going to have a situation similar to the Clinton. And the Clinton was a party line vote to impeach in the House and acquittal by party lines in the Senate. And the difference in the Watergate was you had John Dean, you had the tapes, and you had the president's party members going to him saying, we can't support you anymore.
Interesting. Well, It's going to be a fascinating week ahead. Stanley, I appreciate it always.
Always
Thank
a pleasure.
You. All right, when we come back, everyone, the professor who correctly predicted the last 9 presidential elections, he's got a new prediction. He says the guy on your screen will be impeached, and that will pay off for the Democrats big time at the polls. Professor Alan Lichtman next to explain how he comes to that rationale.